What do you do when the struggles and achievements of so many women are forgotten from popular history? We uncover them and write them back into the narrative, obviously. That's exactly what our guest this episode does in his debut book, The Lost Heer. Harleen Singh's book spotlights the contributions of women who fearlessly fought patriarchal tradition and colonial rule in Punjab. From challenging female infanticide to participating in our freedom movement, these women did it all. I'm really looking forward to getting to know them better, and I hope you are too. Harleen, welcome to the reading list. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me, please.
So, for our listeners who are unfamiliar with the history of undivided Punjab, do you want to talk us through what the book is actually about?
Sure. My book is actually about the history of colonial Punjab as seen through the women who lived through it. You see, Punjab being a very martial province where our stories revolve around warriors, of fighters, of Maharajas, we tend to neglect the 50% of our population, which were the women of Punjab. And by doing so, we neglect the femininity of Punjab. In cases where we talk about women, it's usually women who are warriors themselves, or they take very male-centric roles in our history. By writing this book, I tried to understand the nuances in Punjab, the diversity of women in Punjab. The book is called Women in Colonial Punjab and not Women of Colonial Punjab, because I believe that Punjab has been at the crossroads of civilizations for centuries. You don't only have people who spoke Punjabi, but you have people who've moved here, lived here for centuries and have become a part of the wide tapestry of Punjab. So women, doesn't matter, they were Afghan women, they were Bengali women, they were Marwari women, whoever came here, settled here, made Punjab their home, it is their story. So now what I did to this book is I saw Punjab through a varied lens of different ethnicities, different languages, cultures, subcultures, and dialects.
I remember when we were talking about the book before this, you mentioned it was also the women from colonial England who came to Punjab, settled here, and contributed to this society. Those are also included in your story,
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. It's also the British women who came here, settled here, made Punjab their home, even though they would not properly assimilate in the Punjabi society, but still they contributed to the society in their own ways.
So what inspired you to write the book?
So it is actually my grandmother. So the story of The Lost Heer is actually starts with a conversation I had with my grandmother. That's almost 12 years ago at a wedding of my cousin, where I saw my grandmother and her sister reciting Suhags, the wedding songs. And growing up in Delhi, and I did not grow up speaking Punjabi, these Suhags sounded really weird because, one, they had a very peculiar melody, which was very unfamiliar to my ears. I grew up on Gurdas Man's songs, different contemporary Punjabi popular music. So all these Suhags were quite different to me. And I realized that, these songs were passed down to these women from their grandmothers, and they would not be transferred down because my mother wasn't interested and my sister wasn't interested. So with my grandmother, this would get over. So I thought, I need to talk about it. I need to sort of look more into this. So that Suhag really piqued my interest in these forgotten stories or these dying stories of women of Punjab. And then, of course, opened gates to many other places, for example, textiles, recipes and other things, which sort of put me face to face with the fuller picture of Punjab, which is slowly fading.
Have you learned any Suhags yet?
Unfortunately, I have not, but I have collected a few. I don't know how to sing them, but thankfully in the archives, I was able to collect a lot of archival old Suhags and sort of like translated them, but I'm yet to learn how to sing them.
What sets a Suhag apart from the kinds of Punjabi music that we're used to right now?
So Suhags were basically songs which women composed amongst other women, and they were usually sung in a company of women. So you see, back in the day, women would only be working in their homes. They would not have jobs. Most of the women wouldn't really venture out of their villages or even their districts. Yeah. So these women, whatever they saw around them, became a part of their imagination. And all these things were composed in these songs, which talked about their, not just what they wanted, what their desires and what they sort of imagined, these songs sort of gave us a glimpse into the lives of these women whose stories are otherwise not recorded in memoirs and records, because these women were illiterate. They couldn't write, most of them. So their wisdom is recorded in these songs.
How beautiful. What kind of stories would these songs have?
So a lot of Sikhya is like guidance to daughters, telling young girls to be devoted wives, to serve their mothers-in-law, to be good mothers. They talked about morals. They talked about all these good things which mothers were supposed to transfer to their daughters. So Suhags is basically moral education in verse.
Can we talk about the title of the book now? It's called The Lost Heer.
Right.
Why did you choose that?
I think for me, as a diaspora Punjabi, Heer is the most quintessential Punjaban. For any non-Punjabi who knows a little bit about Punjabi history, Punjabi folklore, knows about Heer Ranjha. Bollywood has made films on Heer Ranjha, and Heer was the most iconic Punjabi name. And also, apart from that, Heer represents this rebellious spirit. She stood up against society. She dared to love. She stood up against patriarchy, against the clergy, and as a result, she is celebrated in our folklore. However, most parents still don't want to name their daughters Heer, because in spite of the fact that she's celebrated in folklore, she's shunned in practice. So for me, Heer represented this rebellious spirit of a Punjaban who's always here to express herself. And that spirit is in every Punjaban I know. So all these women whose stories are lost, they have a spirit of Heer in them, but they're lost in time. And hence the book is called The Lost Heer.
So for those of us who are unfamiliar with the story of Heer Ranjha, can you give us a quick intro to it?
Absolutely. So Heer Ranjha is a love story of a girl called Heer and a guy called Tido Ranjha. They met and they fell in love. However, they couldn't marry because society wouldn't let them marry. So Heer was forced to marry to another guy. Ranjha became a jogi. He left. For 16 years, he became a jogi. He wandered across the land to look for Heer. And once Heer found him, they eloped. And the society pursued them, and they eventually got married. But when it was time for Heer to leave for her new marital home, that's Ranjha's home, she was poisoned. Oh. And so Ranjha killed himself. So it's a tragic love story. Yeah. But the fact that Heer stood up against the clergy in a lot of episodes, the fact that Heer, in spite of being married, chose Ranjha and dared to marry him, tells a lot about the character of Heer. And that's why a lot of Punjabi parents for centuries were scared. They wanted to read Heer, but they did not want their daughters to become Heer.
So how are you challenging the perception that we as Punjabis have of Heer through the book?
I think for me, Heer is not only a sad, tragic love story, which Heer has been made into, we all talk about Heer Ranjha ki prem kahani, and that's about it. But I think there's so much more to Heer than being a tragic love heroine. She was the one who really took the stand when Ranjha came to her home, So she is that bold figure. Mm-hmm. And I think instead of focusing on that tragic image of Heer as that heroine who dies in the end, I wanted to focus more on the other side of Heer, the Heer who was resilient, the Heer who was bold, the Heer who had an agency. And that is what I've done in my book. So the women that I've found across the archives, these women have been lost in history. And instead of, giving them a voice, because that's not my job, I tried to look into little shreds of evidence, whatever they did, to put out their agency to the public.
So talking about archives, what role did the archives, photos, films play in your research?
I think photographs gave me a peek into the visual memory of a lost time. How when colonialism came to Punjab and photography became mainstream, a lot of women would not go to the studios because of strict purdah conditions. And so the early photographs we see of the first generation of Punjabi women in photo studios gives us a glimpse of how colonialism affected these women. We see them wearing Western clothes, but with a lot of Indian additions to it, or them wearing wristwatches with like Parsi sari. So pictures give us a glimpse, like a visual glimpse of how these women were. The other archives, the magazines, the women's magazines, the newspapers, gives us a peek into what the women were thinking, because that has their opinions, you know. And then, of course, you have these papers, these private papers, again, gives us a glimpse of what the women were thinking, what they wanted to do, what they wanted to achieve. So archives, in a way, helped me understand the women whose stories were not otherwise recorded in the mainstream history.
When we were talking before, you mentioned how close you were with your Nani, right? And how your relationship with her and the stories that she told you played a role in how you wrote the book. So I want us to talk a little bit about how your generational history and attachment and connection to Punjab played a role in how you wrote the book now.
Right. I think whatever I know of Punjab came through my grandmother, because none of us, like including my parents, were born in Punjab. I have no relative in Punjab. So in my entire Khandan is in Delhi. So my only connection with Punjab was through the stories of my grandmother. And her dialect was a very important connection that I have with the land that I thought was lost. Also her recipes, which gave me a glimpse of her lost village, the traditions, the folk songs, and everything. My grandmother was originally from Sheikhupura, which is a very small town right next to Nankana Sahib. But she grew up in Lahore mostly. However, Sheikhupura was a very important part of her existence. She would talk about the bars, the jungles there. There were a lot of jungles in Sheikhupura. She used to talk about the Gidda of Sheikhupura, which was very peculiar in a way, because when she moved to East Punjab, Delhi, and when she used to see Giddas in East Punjab, she wouldn't understand it because it was alien to her. So a lot of these cultural memories remained with her, and it passed down to me through her observations. And I think that had a great impact on me when I was writing the book, because that really told me how Punjab was not a monolithic society. It's a very diverse society, and every few kilometers the dialects change, the subcultures change, and everything changes. And I think it was through my grandmother that, in spite of not living in Punjab, I came face to face with the essence of Punjab.
What's the one story or recipe that she passed down to you that's always going to stay with you?
I think I religiously follow one recipe every year. Every monsoons, I make kheer pure. Kheer, as you know, is rice pudding. Pure is basically wheat flour, good water, some soft. It's made into a pancake, and you eat it with the kheer. That was a popular Savan recipes that girls used to cook whenever they used to come back to their parents' houses. And at the last day of Savan, women used to, ride swings in their villages, and that was the beginning of the Tej or the Tiya festivals in Punjab.
And folk songs and poetry also played a very important role in this period, right?
Yeah, it did, yes. Because as you know, that a lot of women's stories were not written down, and whatever women knew was through these folk songs, which were passed down through generations. Also, I think folk songs also were a way in which a lot of women would express their emotions that they could not otherwise do. For example, there's a very famous Punjabi folk song, Ki Ni main sas kutni kutni sanduka ole, which means that I want to hit my mother-in-law behind the sanduk, behind the box. And when the young daughters-in-law used to sing it, it was just taken playfully because it was like an innocent song. However, it reflects this frustration that the daughter-in-law had, but she expressed it through the folk songs. So you find a lot of these funny folk songs which sort of expressed women's emotions, suppressed women's emotions. And that tells you how women's ideas or emotions or feelings were reflected in these folk songs. And they're very diverse.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
How did you feel as you were uncovering these cultural treasures, right, of generations of women, as somebody who did not receive them from,
The women.
yeah. How, as you were doing your research, what did that feel like for you?
I think I was aware of the fact that as a man, it's very hard for me to even understand 1% of women's experience. However, I stayed true to the archival methods that I had learned. I began to document whatever I found in the archives, whatever scraps of information I found. And it's also not fair to give your own narrative to these stories, because it's not my story to tell. So I made sure that I used the correct methodology. What I called the informed imagination is when, of course, I had some piece of information from the archives. I sort of used the correct historical perspective and context to understand it, and tried to do it as faithfully as I could without taking away the agency from those stories.
How does one do that? Because these are people that we don't know, we never met. And oftentimes stories about them and their writings have been lost through
Yes.
time, but also sidelined, right?
Right.
So when you're discovering these women now in your research,
Right.
these are names on a piece of paper. How do you build them up as people for yourself?
Right. I'll give an example. It'll be easier for you to understand. So let's talk about this lady called Rani Nur-un-Nisa. Nur-un-Nisa was born in a place called Raikot, which is near modern-day Ludhiana. And she came from a Rajput Muslim family. So at an intersection of different religious identities, a Rajputani of Suryavanshi or Chandravanshi descent, but proud of her Muslim religion, and a custodian of the holy swords of Guru Gobind Singh.
Wow.
Right? So this woman was only found in the margins of pension records of British archives, because she had a son who had died and she had no descendant. So the only information I had of this woman was through the pension records and some papers of Octoloony or other British spies who eyed her kingdom.
Wow.
Right? So what I did, my technique was to, of course, get all the information I found in the archives, and then also began to understand her domains. So Raikot, for example, where she was a very strong hold of the Rajput clan, where apart from major religions, you had folk religions. So I began to understand women's traditions in those areas when Rani Nur-un-Nisa was ruling. So then the melas that happened, women's melas, and what women did, their local practices. And by understanding the local context, I was able to give face to that unknown woman who otherwise was lost in history and was only found in the pension records.
I can't imagine how detail-oriented your research must have been to pick out people, so many people, because the book talks about a lot of women, right?
Yeah.
And it's across like years and years. So your time frame is very massive.
Yeah.
But to be able to go through all of your archives and just identify women who may be significant, may not be, you don't know.
Yeah.
And then let me pick this one name out, explore that, because Nur-un-Nisa is one of the first women in Punjab who encounters
a Gora, a white man.
Exactly, right? And that's where the journey of the Britishers coming into Punjab begins with her.
Right. And I think before I talk more about this, I want to talk about what I mean by colonialism in my book.
Sure.
You see, when we talk about colonial Punjab, we talk about the end of Ranjit Singh's rule in 1849 and the beginning of the British Raj. However, in my work, colonialism really means the first interaction that the Punjabi women had with the Gora. And the Gora, in this case, wanted to usurp or take over her domains or kingdoms. And in this case, Rani Nur-un-Nisa is the first Punjaban who really directly confronts a Gora Sahib, who in this case is an Irish adventurer, George Thomas. So that's what I mean by colonial period in my work. And Nur-un-Nisa, as you rightly said and pointed out, that she was the first Punjabi woman to write a letter to a white man. And it was through that letter that George Thomas entered Punjab for the first time, thus opening the floodgates, which would later result into the colonization of Punjab 50 years later. And not just Nur Nisa, you have a lot of other minor female chiefs, for example, Rani Daya Kaur of Ambala, Rani Lakshman Kaur of Firozpur, who were masters of these independent kingdoms. And yet for them, both Ranjit Singh on the other side of the Satluj and Okhtuluni were basically invaders who eyed their kingdom. And I remember a little scrap of information in one of the archives where Lakshman Kaur really complains how she rules this large domain, large fort of Firozpur. However, the zamindars of her kingdom do not respect her because they do not respect the rule of a woman. So these women were not just fighting other invaders who were after their kingdom, but also their local populace who sort of looked to these women with a lot of sexist ideas. They would not agree with them being ruled by a lady.
And it's important to note that these women didn't inherit these kingdoms. They were married to people who ruled them and then became widowed.
Yes.
And they didn't have male heirs of the age of being an adult, considering to be able to rule, which is why they had to step up, defend their kingdoms, defend their families, their own people.
Right.
Not just from the British, but also from their fellow
absolutely
chieftains,
their neighbors, right? And everybody else. So yes, these women, a lot of these women were also sort of princesses from other kingdoms, other chiefdoms. But as you rightly said, these women, most of them were childless widows, because in chiefdoms where you had a male heir, these women did not really have to worry a lot about inheritance. But a lot of these women who drew the sword were women whose heirs had died, or women who felt that they had to defend their kingdom because you had these relatives who were after their treasures or their lands.
And at the end of their struggles, a lot of these kingdoms fall into the control of the British, and then these royal women have to survive on the pensions that the British give them, right? That I remember reading something in the book about the Red
Book.
Red Book.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little?
Sure. So when Ranjit Singh's kingdom was annexed by the British thought that it was their responsibility to sustain and support the widows and dependents of Ranjit Singh, who were mostly females, because all the male heirs and offsprings were either killed or they were exiled. So a lot of these widows of both Ranjit Singh and his sons were now the responsibility of the British Sarkar, as he said. And so their names were registered in this thick red book with, of course, their rank, based on their rank, and the pensions were also based on their rank. What is peculiar is that since most of these women were in purdah, there was always this trouble of verifying whether these women were alive or not. Because whenever you had this officer who was there to give their pension money, he couldn't enter the zanana because of the purdah. So we do find cases where a widow had already died, but some of her servants were using that pension money for years and years and years after.
So can we talk about the purdah a little? Because the purdah is a very big social construct that plays a very important role all the way from the time of Ranjit Singh to when we get independence. Absolutely. And further, right?
Yeah.
Why did this institution exist? What was it?
Well, we do not know much about its origin. However, we find answers to this question through women's journals of the time period. For example, Hardevi Roshan Lal, who was the first female journalist in Punjab, speculates that the purdah came with the Islamic invasions of India. She says that how purdah was never a part of the Hindu society, and when the Muslims came, a lot of Hindu women adopted the purdah to save themselves. Then there's another viewpoint about purdah, which is that purdah represented rank. Is that if you were somebody of a higher social rank, you could afford a purdah. So if, let's say, I became a Rai Bahadur, I would now ask all the women of my family to be in purdah because that is a symbol of rank for me.
And being in purdah means what?
So being in purdah means a lot of things. One, the physical purdah of being veiled. Then there's a purdah of lihaz, of your voice. So, for example, a lot of daughters-in-law would not speak loudly in front of their fathers-in-law. So these daughters-in-law were meant to not to be seen or heard.
Oh.
Right? So there were different levels of purdah in the society. Then there was an Islamic purdah, which was peculiar to the Muslims, because in Islam, the purdah has a religious context to it, where Quran has certain guidelines about purdah. So purdah, essentially, by the colonial period, it, of course, in physical form, it represented wearing veils or burqa for Muslim women. But also the social purdah of where women were not allowed to behave in a certain way in front of their men.
But they were allowed to be with one another without purdah?
That is correct, yes. That is correct.
So a lot of wealthy households then in this time in Punjab would have separate sections in the house just for women in purdah?
That is true. So every Punjabi household had a mardana, which was when you entered the house, which is now the modern drawing room. And then the zanana, the back rooms where women used to live. And we need to understand that, not everyone lived in huge houses back in the day.
Of course.
Houses were as tiny as they are today in like old Delhi. So imagine how cramped the conditions were.
So the purdah also meant that a lot of them could not see a regular doctor. Right?
Yes, that is
correct. To be very specific.
That is correct. There are very funny incidents that we find from reports. There's this one lady who is convinced by her husband to get vaccination, but she's in purdah. So they had to get a chadar, make a little hole, and she had to take her hand out of that, and that's how she got her vaccination.
At least she got vaccinated.
She got vaccinated. Saved herself.
Truly. Wow. Okay. So then when the women are in purdah, there's still a lot of different forms of resistance that's happening throughout the book, right?
Yes.
Because a lot of the women that you mention in your book are in purdah still.
Yes.
Can we talk about those forms of resistance
Right.
a little?
There was always resistance in purdah. I mean, women as human beings would resist to whatever is happening around them in the society. We see that with the emergence of the Women's Journal in 1880s Punjab, women come face to face with the larger national movement. This is before the independence movement. This is like the social movements in Punjab, where there are talks about raising the age of marriage, for example. So we find this instance in 1880s where a lot of Parda Nashin women of Lahore, they write a telegram to the then Viceroy thanking him to pass a bill, for raising the age of marriage. That's a form of resistance. Then you find a lot of Parda Nashin Muslim women who give an address to Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan when he comes to Gurdaspur, asking him to, open more girls' schools. Then you have a form of resistance in Parda with the Gadarite women, for example, women in Parda, but they were letterboxes of sedition. They were using their Parda to hide and smuggle these seditious letters across their networks.
Oh, wow.
So there's a lot was happening behind the Parda as well.
So going back to the royal women now, right? The women who probably were also in Parda, who are fighting both their neighbors and local chieftains, but also the British.
Yeah.
What are the different forms of resistance that they adopted to hold back these adversaries?
Right. So a lot of these women, I'll give you an example of Rani Lakshman Kaur, the chieftain of Firozpur. Now, Firozpur was a very strategic location, right on the Satluj River. Right across the Satluj was Ranjit Singh's domains. To the left was the British Punjab, the protected domains of Punjab. And you could see Sindh and Afghanistan also from Firozpur, because Sindh was recently been captured by the British at that time period, and Afghanistan was eyeing India. So Rani Lakshman Kaur actually writes a lot of letters through her scribes. We don't know if she was educated, but she wrote letters through her scribes to different British chieftains, British officers. And you find these British officers visiting her domains and she having conversations with them. So it's very unusual to see meetings between a female chieftain and a British officer, but Rani Lakshman Kaur defied those norms and had frequent meetings with the British, told them her concerns, and also suggested solutions. For example, she wanted British to discipline the zamindars, which were around her, who were not paying her taxes. Or she even wanted to not be a part of this struggle, because every year there were Ranjit Singh's allies who were attacking her, or you had zamindars attacking her. So she wanted the British to sort of exchange her domain with somewhere peaceful. She even suggested that. So she was actively engaging in political discussion with the British, at the same time resisting people who were eyeing her domains.
I found the parts in the book where the women of Punjab initially meet the missionaries so interesting, because that's where the entire journey of transformation for the lives of these women begin. I was wondering if we could talk about that a little, the initial meetings and then the impacts that they had on the women.
Right. Interestingly, the first Christian missionaries to Punjab were not British. They were Americans. The Presbyterian Christian Mission, they were Protestants. And they came from Philadelphia, and it took them a whole year to travel from America to Ludhiana.
That's a really long time.
So they would take a steamship to Calcutta, and they had to wait for the monsoons to take the boat up to Kanpur. And from Kanpur, they took like bullock carts to Delhi, and from there to Ludhiana. So it took them a whole year to reach Punjab. And the first of the missionaries were the Janvier family, who were of French origin, Americans. And then you had another family, the Newtons. And the woman I talk about is Elizabeth Newton, who was an American lady, and she had this missionary zeal in her heart to, she wanted to spread the light of Christ to savages. And so she did. She reached Ludhiana. For the first few months, she was not able to find female students because everyone was wary of Christians. And interestingly, a lot of Punjabis saw Christians as untouchables, white men as untouchable. Because
why is that?
Because they do not fit into any of the caste they don't fit into caste systems. So they were like achoots, basically.
Because they couldn't categorize them in the reality that they know.
Absolutely.
Wow.
So they were considered as achoots. So these women, these first missionaries could not find female scholars for a very long time, until somebody from Karnal, a British officer, gave Elizabeth a female orphan, who was an Indian girl. And that's where she began the orphanage in Ludhiana. And the orphanage grew into the first proper girls' missionary school.
Wow.
So Elizabeth wanted these girls to know what she thought was the civilized education. And she made sure that the girls did not know the indigenous languages.
And so what was included in the civilized
So it was a lot of Bible, Christian studies, moral education, geography of lands they would never go to. So like England, America, history, which is not their history, the history of the British royal family, all that stuff, and Roman script. She made sure that the girls did not know Urdu or Devanagari or Gurmukhi, because that would mean that these girls would have access to Indian education.
Wow.
So to cut them from indigenous education, she made sure that they knew Roman language, because eventually that would lead them to learn English if they wanted to in the future. So that was the first batch of Christian girls' school in Ludhiana that Elizabeth started. Elizabeth is an important character also because Elizabeth's husband was the guy who brought the printing press to Punjab.
Wow.
So the first printed items you find in Punjab was through that press. And of course, Elizabeth had a great role in helping him set the press. And that's why I see Elizabeth as a pioneer in her own way. The women who were educated in Elizabeth's school, the first generation of Punjabi Christian women, they had a very hybrid existence. They were too brown for white people and too white for Indians.
Oh, God.
Right? And you can see them in their dress. So, for example, one of her most famous students, Selina Golaknath, Selina being a very British name, Golaknath because her husband was a Brahmin convert, Golaknath, and that's how she got Golaknath as a last name. She wore a European gown, but draped herself with a chadar, a dupatta. So a very nice hybrid existence. Selina, when she grew up, she was sent to Jalandhar, which was newly annexed by the British, and she began the first missionary center there.
Wow.
Because the white women could not get access to the Indian women. Selina, being a high caste convert, could get access to the Zanana. So she would go and preach Christianity in Punjabi to Punjabi women.
That's so interesting.
So the British Raj, in a way, also gave rise to this new community of Punjabi Christians who had a Western religion, because it is a westernized form of Christianity, and yet they were Indians in their own ways.
Wow. So contrast this to high-born women who were either Muslim, Sikh or Hindu in Punjab who did receive an education, right?
Right.
But the education they received was within the four walls of their own house?
Right, mostly yes. So the education that Punjabi women received were mostly moral and religious education.
Okay.
Women in Punjab were taught Gurmukhi alphabet, and back in the day, most of the scriptures were in Gurmukhi, either Guru Granth Sahib, Ramayan, Gita, everything was in Gurmukhi. So they were taught Gurmukhi. The Muslim women were taught Urdu, Arabic, not Urdu, sorry, Arabic, and some Farsi, basic Farsi to read Gulistan or Dabistan, all these texts. But mostly their focus was on religious education, and they were taught enough so that they could teach their children. So basically, mothers used to impart education to their young children, but that really stopped when the British Raj came. Because when the British Raj came, Farsi was removed, a new form of education came, Urdu became the official language, and so the mother's wisdom could not be imparted anymore to their sons because it was not useful to them. So British Raj, in a way, sort of cut mothers from their sons and daughters.
And so when it was a mother teaching them in the religious and moral education, what was it that they were being taught besides how to read the holy scriptures?
Right. So I'll give you an example of one of the first Khalifas of the Ahmadiyya community. He talks in his biography that his mother used to teach him Quran in Punjabi, the fiqh, the Islamic jurisprudence in Punjabi, and other laws in Punjabi, which is the basis of the Sharia law. So women, what I'm saying is women actually knew much more than the scripture. They knew about religious laws, the customary practices, the customary laws, all these things which were important for a citizen of 19th century Punjab.
And obviously also the oral histories and oral cultural histories that are passed down that we talked about before,
absolutely.
The food, how to run a household, how to take care of your in-laws, all of that as well, right?
Yes.
So now going from the first contact that women of Punjab have with Western quote-unquote education, as time passes, we see the transformation of different religious groups and how they are educating their women as well in Punjab.
Yes.
And we see a lot of fracturing happening in what different religions are teaching their women. Can we talk about that a little?
Sure. So by the 1880s, it's been almost 40 years since the British are in Punjab. This new generation of Punjabi men have been to convent schools. A lot of them were faced with this idea that they had to convert to Christianity to progress. So there is obviously a reaction that we see within Punjabis from all different faiths. This new generation of Punjabis use British education, English language, and methods that the missionaries use in Punjab to further their own religious identities. So for example, when the Arya Samaj begins in Punjab, it uses the English language, the tract system, which is basically writing English tracts as a response to British criticism of Hinduism, and other methods to further Hinduism as Arya Samajis saw it to the Hindus. Singh Sabha does that, Arya Samajis, the Dev Samaj does that, Brahmo Samaj does that, all different religious groups do that. They also start Western style schools, the proper schools that we know of today. But instead of teaching Bible in the schools, they have religious education, but with that they have modern subjects like arithmetic, geography, and whatever you need to find jobs. So you see that these reform groups start to repackage themselves as brown missionaries in a way, because they're doing the same tactics. They're going around doing street prachar, they're asking people to convert to their form of religion. The same things that missionaries were doing before them.
And as a product of this new form of education, you also have a lot of the firsts that come out of it, right? You have the first woman who gets a doctorate, the first woman who becomes a doctor.
Yes.
She gets an MA in history. She is a product of this convergence of Western education and traditional education, right?
So there is this understanding that these reform men have, that the British looked down upon them because they believed that Indians were treating their women worse than animals, according to them. So what these reform men do is that one of the main things in their reform groups is what they call the emancipation of women. Of course, it's not what we see emancipation as now. For them, women still had to adhere to the domestic roles of being a good mother, wife, and daughter. And in many cases also had to remain in purdah, but they had to be educated. They had to know basic things like English language. They had to change their clothing, for example. In Punjab, throughout the 19th century, women, both in urban centers and villages, wore a choli, the Punjabi choli, as I call it, because it had a flap which covered the navel. And when the British came with their own sets of Victorian morality, they saw it as vulgar. The idea of women exposing their bodies was seen vulgar. So the reform men, in order to model themselves with the new Raj, they began to preach against what they call as nudity. They asked women to cover up their bodies, get rid of the choli, get rid of jewelry in many cases. There were many books written by these reform men called Gehna Khandan, ya Gehna Viched, where they asked women to throw off jewelry because jewelry represented this side of barbaric India, as the British portrayed Indians as, as lesser than them. So you see a lot of anti-jewelry agitation in these reform literature. Women are doing it themselves. And these women are also being educated, basic things, domestic education, crochet, for example, which came from Europe. Domestic cooking based on British recipes, but like Indianized version of it. And then these women learn different tactics from the British magazines from the time period to start their own magazines. So Hardevi Roshan Lal, this woman from Lahore, she goes to England for a couple of years, comes back to Lahore, 1888. She starts her own magazine called Bharat Bhagini, where she's asking women, how to make jellies and jams and preserves, which was unknown in Punjab at that time period. Or she's asking women how to knit in the British pattern, or telling women about buttons, cuffs. Does not exist in Punjab. So a lot of new technology comes at that time period. And then reform women also become professional women. So the first doctor, Dr. Prem Devi, another Lahori girl, is from Dev Samaj. And Dev Samaj is the most radical of all Samajas because unlike other Samajas, it asks for co-education of girls and boys, which was scandalous at that time period. Right? So Prem Devi becomes a doctor, starts a women's clinic, discards the purdah, another scandalous thing to do in Lahore at that time period, and treats women free of cost.
This hybrid culture that is being formed, it was so interesting because when I was reading the book, I think there's an instance where you're talking about a Punjabi woman going for a picnic, right, on the riverside, and you it's a whole thing. She's taking her picnic basket. There's a blanket. There's probably a couple of people who went there to help her, and then she opens her picnic basket and there's seek kebab in it.
Yes.
Like, what?
Yes.
Where did this come from?
Yes. So this is the hybrid culture we're talking about. How these. And this is the Purdah Nashin woman. She comes from a family of very strict Purdah, where there were instances in the family where the father did not know that a certain girl was his daughter because he had not seen her for 20 years.
Yeah.
Right? So she came from a very, very strict Purdah family, and she moves to Punch, where her husband was posted as one of the ministers in the royal court of Maharaja of Kashmir. But there, she's in Purdah, but she embraces European culture or whatever she's seeing around her. She has a beautiful picnic basket she's imported from England, has a sterling silver tea set, but she's eating Sikh kebab, as you said. So there's a beautiful hybrid culture that you see happening at that time period.
Yeah, so we get some very interesting positives from that, but there's also a different, there's a change in the culture of what is considered Punjabi and moral that is happening at this time, right? Because as we're bringing in Western sensibilities and judging indigenous practices or native practices with those Western sensibilities, there's a lot of change happening in our society. For example, one thing you write about is how women used to bathe in Punjab and how that transformed once we started engaging more and more with the colonial forces. That made me really irritated. That made me very irritated because there was this constant policing of what women can and cannot do, how they should look or they shouldn't, when they should be covered, when they shouldn't, who they should talk to, who they shouldn't. But that happens throughout the book, and it's a given. You're not even questioning it because that was just the state of society at that time. But this instance of how women can bathe, how they should bathe, where they should bathe, what festival they can celebrate, how they mourn when somebody dies, how they celebrate when somebody gets married. It really infuriated me.
And that was the nature of the reform era, because when reform came, they saw everything Punjabi, everything indigenous as barbaric. And they wanted to reform it, again, in the light of their own newer ideas of reform. There's this lady we talk about, Mai Bhagwati. She's from Hoshiarpur. And she is growing up at the time period when, as you said, public bathing was being frowned upon. And it was custom in Punjab for women to go to bath in public baths. It wasn't an issue until the British came and they saw it as like a violation of morality. And it became such a huge scandal that when Dadabhai Naorji came to Lahore for the Congress, men just sneered that, if Punjabi men can't stop their women from bathing naked, how can they run the country? So it became a national issue, right? It was such a big scandal. But Mai Bhagwati, she is from the League of Women who actually backs this idea of policing women's bodies. But what she does is she reinvents it in her own way. So as you said, Siapa, the whole idea of women beating their chests and singing eulogies when somebody dies, was considered offensive by the reform men. Mai Bhagwati actually rewrote the Siapas. She got a book. Instead of what she called as vulgar Siapas, she rewrote them as bhajans, what she called as clean bhajans. But then there was also a reaction to it because not everyone agreed with it, right? So there was a section of women, a lot of women, who disagreed with the way these reform men were policing their bodies. There's this very famous folk song from Punjab, which was written by some women whose family members became Arya Samajis, and they were restricting them from having different fasts or keeping shrads, right? So this song goes, Arya ne at chak layi sare pind de shrad band kite. It's like Aryas have become a nuisance. They have stopped the shrads across the villages. Or a Singh Sabha woman singing how Mahi mera Singh Sabiya mainu gidda paadna deve, which means my husband has become a Singh Sabha member and he has forbidden me to dance at all. So there were reactions that we see from these women, and they're recorded in these folk songs.
And so at this time, there is also something called the purdah clubs that have become popular, right? For women who are within the purdah, but finally want to actually make some friends, socialize.
Right.
What role did these clubs play in preserving and promoting these ideas?
So the background of the Purdah Club is that, when the first generation of civil servants, Punjabi civil servants, when they got access to British clubs, they had to face discrimination because the British, as an excuse, said that because you guys don't bring your women to our clubs, you have no right to dance with our women. Because you can't dance with our women if you can't bring your women to the clubs. So to find a solution to this deadlock, a lot of these elite Punjabi men began purdah clubs across urban centers in Punjab.
The men started them.
The men started them, advised women to start clubs. But the women, of course, were the initiators of these clubs. So what used to happen is basically in a city, you would get a little piece of land, usually gardens, cover them with like tents and qanats. You would invite all the elite women of the city, would gather there. You would have a handful of mem sahibs who would come there, and the women would talk. Now, most women could not speak English. So what would happen, you would have little girls, usually daughters of these Punjabi women who went to convent schools to act as interpreters. You would have gramophones, you would have a harmonium, you would have Indian women playing a sitar, a white woman, singing a song from the London stage. So a lot of stuff was happening, exchanging ideas. However, that was also the first time that you would have Punjabi women and Indian and British women really coming into close contact and also share their politics. So a lot of women's journals of the time period talk about the racism that a lot of Punjabi women had to face because a certain mem sahibs did not like the way this women dressed or the way this women talked. So you do see a lot of tension in the women's journals from that time period. Because you see before that, a lot of racist incidents are talked about by Punjabi men who worked for British men, right? But when the purdah clubs begin and when Punjabi women for the first time are interacting with the British women, they get to taste racism for the first time. And that really helps in the formation of what I call the nationalist movement in Punjab, because a few years after the Purdah Club is inaugurated in Punjab, you have the proper first anti-British agitation. And one of the leading ladies in Lahore against the British is the founding member of the Lahore Purdah Club, Sarla Devi Chaudhrani. So basically, in a way, Purdah clubs, even though they were social spaces for women to socialize and interact, they also helped in the formation of the nationalist movement in Punjab. In the pre-Jallianwala Bagh era.
Yes, that is important to say. Were there any positive stories of sisterhood and collaboration between different groups that came out from the Purdah clubs?
Yes, of course. There were a lot of stories of friendships that women had. There were a lot of stories of women going to picnic together, going on trips together. Then, of course, a lot of rich Punjabi women who could afford used to employ white governesses. So, of course, there are positive stories of their relationships also. So, of course, you have all kinds of people who used to exist. But the main conflict existed between what I call the Mem Sahib class, which were basically women, wives of the ruling class, and the Punjabi women, who were wives of the Rai Bahadurs and other people. But then there were also the working class Punjabi women, whose interaction with the white women was through the missionaries. And that was much more warmer because missionary women used to learn the local language, unlike the Mem Sahib, who, even though they used to live in India for 20, 30 years, would not learn the local language and would act as if they were still in Britain.
Interesting. So there's this sense of moral superiority that still carries on even if you live in a place for 20 years, you engage with those people.
And what is interesting, if you talk about the way the white women operated in India, is very interesting. They used to come every year, what they call the season, en masse, young unmarried British women, and that the entire mass was called the fishing fleet. They would enter the shores of India, look for the perfect match. If they could find somebody in the season, great. If they couldn't, they had to return back home, and they were called returned empties.
So many questions.
Yes.
What was the time frame of the season? When?
Well, the season was usually the winters, the Indian winters, because they're not as harsh as the winters in England. So it's usually around November they used to come.
And where did this happen?
Across India.
Across
India. So they used to come at all the ports of India. Let's say I had a relative or a family friend in Peshawar or Mysore, they would go there.
Wow.
And then they would find a guy who would be appropriate for them, have a courtship, of course, with another woman, because
Of
they
course.
can't do
Of
it
course.
in private, Victorian ideas. And if they happened to get married to the person, they become the Mem Sahab. If not, then they are the returned empties. And then they come back again in the second season.
Oh, wow.
So these Mem Sahabs, when they settled in India, one of the things they did was to make a little England in the middle of India.
Of course, because why not?
And one of the things they often used to repeat is that the main aim of the Mem Sahab in India was to save themselves from India.
What does that mean?
That means that they wanted to save themselves from becoming native.
Because
Going
being
native.
native was...
Going native really means it's a colonial expression to save oneself from going native, which means that they, even though they were in India in like 40 degrees temperature, they would still wear a double-layered gown as if they were in England. They adhered to the same recipes, the same food habits. They would still have chin table cover in the heat of Dehradun, even though ants would eat it.
Oh.
But they wanted to make sure that everything was up to mark as it was in England, because they believed that their husbands were battling India outside,
Okay.
the native, and they have to battle with the household staff. So they had their own really weird versions of what it means to be a Mem Sahab. And you can see them, have a glimpse of them in a lot of guidebooks you find across colonial India. So there's a very famous guidebook called The Indian Housekeeper and Cook, which was written by this lady called Flora Annie Steele. Herself, a Punjabi Mem Sahab, lived in Kasur for 20 years and did a first academic paper on Fulkari. But she, in spite of being in India for 20 years, had a lot of racist ideas about India and Indians. So the Mem Sahab's job was to protect herself from India. And another important thing is the motherhood of the Mem Sahab. So you would have a child in India, but the children had to leave India by the time they turned 2 or 3, because if they stayed in India for much longer, they could go native, because they could learn the language from their ayahs and they would forget their Britishness. So they would be sent back to be schooled in England, and when they sort of turned 18, 19, they would come back to work as whatever their fathers were working as.
And the fathers were always going to be the white British officers that came here.
Yes.
So the First World War does something very transformative to Punjabi society. It also coincides with the transformation of the purdah system. Can you unpack a little what impact the First World War had on Punjab and the women of Punjab?
Sure. So Punjab was always a sword arm of the British Empire. And a lot of Punjabis were recruited in the British armies. They were sent to France and Mesopotamia and other fronts to fight the war. A lot of women were left behind. And so these women had to cope and see what could be done in a changing Punjabi society. This is also the time when the Ghadar movement starts in Punjab. So a lot of women join the revolutionaries. A lot of women who need money, they also join illicit trade like badan faroshi. So you have a lot of women who start human trafficking gangs.
Oh God.
Right? Because now the soldiers are away, you have brides who are back home, who are alone. So a lot of these women would just like go and like kidnap these girls and sell them far off places. But at the same time, you also had a different thing that's happening in the urban centers. You have the first Punjabi girls graduating. You have a lot of Punjabi women for the first time who are entering in what I call the war efforts. So you have these women getting together, knitting, making these packages for soldiers, asking other women to help in the recruitment. So women are getting more and more vocal and expressing themselves more and more, because Parda is also easing in that time period. By the time the First World War ends, you have the Rowlatt Act that is passed in Punjab, and which is followed by the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. And after the massacre, you suddenly see women across Punjab join popular mass protests against the British. Women are leaving Parda more and more. Women are expressing themselves more and more. They also start being jailed, because before that women were not jailed as political prisoners. But in the 1920s, you see the first female political prisoners from Punjab. Puran Devi goes to jail. And eventually, by the time the decade ends, 1920s, you see women in almost all domains in Punjab. You have Manmohani Zutshi, for example, becomes the first female president of the Lahore Students' Union. She is doing revolutionary activities also with her friends. Then 30s comes. 30s brings much more changes in Punjab. Purdah is almost gone amongst Hindu and Sikh women, but 30s starts the beginning of the fading of Purdah amongst Muslim women as well. So you have Jahanara Shah Nawaz, for example. She discards the Purdah and she represents Punjabi women, Indian women in the roundtable conferences. Then 30s also has a lot of Punjabi women who join professions. You have the first lawyers. You have the first proper MBBS Punjabi
And there's
women.
very fascinating conversations that happen between the men to allow the women to become a lawyer or become a doctor.
Yes,
right?
yes. So men don't want women because they think that women should only take care of their household, and they're like the women cannot solve disputes because they themselves are the ones who begin disputes. So a lot of misogyny is being is seen in these men-only circles, but eventually women become lawyers, they become MLAs, they join the politics, they become pilots, and then you have the first female superstar also from Punjab, Mukhtar Begum of Amritsar. So 30s is basically what I call the flapper age of Punjab, because flapper age is the 20s in the West, but for Punjab it's the 30s in the real sense, because women for the first time are emancipated. They have a very strong voice. Women are also holding conferences with other women. So Punjab has the first all Asian Women's Conference in 1931, which for the first time sees women from all colonized countries get together. And they not only talk about against patriarchy, but they talk against colonialism. So a lot is happening in the 30s. And by the 40s, you see women becoming more and more political. Women joining the League, women joining the communist movement, women joining the Azad Hind Fauj. And by the time the decade ends, you have the partition, which I call the end of Punjab. This is when whatever women had done in the last 20 years is undone with the injustices of partition.
So before we come to that, there is also a transformation in the women themselves that is happening, right? Yes. You come from a system where first women are not allowed to actually have intellectual thought or the capacity for intellectual thought. You go from that into a little bit more of allowing them more freedoms in what they can think about, what they can talk about, who they can interact with. And come to the 30s, now women are openly defying the traditional quote-unquote modest Punjabi woman, what she should be doing, what she shouldn't be doing, to talk about their rights, their space in society, the treatment that they receive in magazines and newspapers and political forums. That transformation, as it happens and as you've written it, it was just, I was so moved by that. And there's obviously so many women that play a part in that, coming to that, right? And then you're right, from there we get into the partition and then everything is undone.
Yes.
What role did women play in the stitching back of lives after it is undone, after that moment of fracture?
Right. I think a lot of women, especially women like Gurbachan Kaur Mann, who was a teacher in Lyalpur before partition, they realized that partition made men into animals, right? And even before partition actually happened, we find this instance at Rawalpindi where you had the first riot in 47 March. And this female MLA visits Pindi from Lahore, and she sees the destruction, the doom, the death. And when she comes back to Lahore, she has one thing to say to the women of Punjab. She says to the women of Punjab, let's undo what the men of Punjab have done, right? So I think there was this sense of sisterhood, even at the time of crisis, that all that is wrong that's happening in Punjab is done by these men, their egos, and the victims are the women. So I think even before the actual partition happened, women were doing a lot of things. They had their own little clubs. When refugees were coming from Pindi to Amritsar, they had their own relief clubs and relief camps. They were doing fundraising and everything. Of course, the riots from May and June made it impossible for them to operate, and eventually that stopped. But when partition happened, and when after partition, when a lot of abductions were done, a lot of these women stepped forward again to bring back those women who were abducted. And so you see women like Mridula Sarabhai or Rameshwari Nehru. She is at Lahore alone in the Lajpat Rai Bhavan, which was the Congress headquarters at Lahore. And she has set up a women's camp. She's touring across Pakistan and looking for women. Similarly, you had Muslim women who were in Jalandhar touring East Punjab and looking for women. So these women were constantly trying to help other women. And in doing so, they were trying to piece together whatever was ruptured in those few months that followed after partition.
And now you have massive communities of Punjabi women, not just in Punjab, but across India and across the world, doing amazing work.
Absolutely.
So that takes me to my last question. How does the Lost Heer contribute to feminist discourse today? Why are these women still important?
I think we don't find much literature on regional feminist history. It's when I talk about feminism, I see it through the lens of Western feminism, the first wave, the second wave, the third wave. But that doesn't fit in all societies, and certainly that does not fit in the case of Punjab. I broadly divide Punjab's feminist movement into what I call the proto-feminist movement, with these women like Hardevi Roshan Lal, who were still adhered to the domestic ideas of femininity, but they were still talking about emancipation. Then the second wave, where you had women from outside like Suladevi Chaudhrani and Marathi women coming to Punjab and starting a new wave of anti-purdah. And then the 30s, the flapper age, and then the 40s. So what I'm saying is that all these, not all societies fit into the Western ideas of feminism. And I think it's very important. It was very important for this text to come out because it really gives a new insight into the history of Punjab as seen by its women, and which is not the same as across the world. So I think maybe in this way, this book is unique. And I believe that future generation of scholars can unearth more women through this book and find more stories which still lie untranslated and lost in the archives. And
Amazing. Harleen, thank you so much for this glimpse into the lives of the women of Punjab during colonial India, but also, I guess, a peek into my own heritage, right? Because I'm also of Punjabi descent, but I didn't grow up in the Punjab, so I didn't hear about any of these women. For our listeners, readers, viewers, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope you pick up the book because it is a beautiful deep dive into the history of the Punjab. If you like this episode of The Reading List, remember to like, share, follow, and subscribe. It helps other people find us. See you next episode.